Here in part 4, let's talk about the 4 major threats to biodiversity associated with human activities. The first driver is habitat destruction. It's simply the removal of the environment and habitat in which these organisms are living. So, for instance, only about 40% of the original tropical rainforests remain today. We know that tropical rainforests are among the regions of highest diversity for plants, microbes, and virtually all animal, and plant systems. Why are we destroying this? Most of the destruction of habitat is associated with agriculture. The world's 8 billion people represent only about 0.01% of all living biomass. Yet since the dawn of civilization, we've been responsible for most of the major declines of wild mammals and plants, simply because we need the habitat to produce food. So, of all the mammals on Earth, we are about 36% of all the biomass. Our food stocks, our cattle in particular, represent about 60% of the biomass, and wild mammals are a mere 4% of that total biomass. The same is true for birds. About 70% of the birds on this planet are associated with chickens and other poultry that we eat, whereas about 30% are wild. We have such a great impact because Western societies eat very high on the trophic food chain. That is, if you think of a food chain as microbes decomposing materials providing nutrients for plants, plants photosynthesizing material based on what they get from the microbes, and herbivores eating plants, and carnivores in turn eating herbivores, we spend more of our diet at the carnivore level rather than at the plant level. The result of all this is that we need more space to grow our animal foods so that we can sustain a high carnivore diet. Whether or not this is sustainable into the future, not 10 years from now, but a century from now, is unclear. The second effect we've had is on introduced species. That is, species are introduced into a region in which they're not native. And natural selection, being what natural selection is, these introduced species are more competitive than the native species, and they end up changing the nature of the ecosystem and destabilizing that ecosystem. So here are a couple of examples: the Nile perch, the brown tree snake, Argentine ants, and a new seaweed species. So the brown tree snake was introduced into the island of Guam. There were no snakes in Guam beforehand, and the snakes have had the impact of essentially removing all of the birds on Guam, decimated that population, and have also had a very negative impact on the reptilian lizard populations, gecko populations in Guam. The Nile perch, which was common along the Nile River, was introduced into Lake Victoria here in Uganda about 70 years ago. And it's led to the near extinction of several hundred native fish species, simply because it's more competitive and much more of a predator than the native species. It's natural selection in action. And the consequence of this natural selection is that invasive species are able to disrupt ecosystems. Here, in the Intermountain West, it's cheatgrass. Cheatgrass, which was introduced by accident on the hooves of cattle, came from Central Asia. And this species promotes fire and is resulting in a conversion of shrublands into annual grasslands. Here you can see some old fire scars that have come through where the fires come through, resulting in a loss of the shrubs. The third area is overexploitation. We make the assumption that every food resource we eat is sustainable, when actually it's not, and we can overfish, overgraze, or overexploit. Here you see tuna on the market in Japan, and tuna are decreasing in abundances. Overfished, overexploited. When I was a child, back in the 60s and 70s, fish sticks were a common food, and all fish sticks were made from Atlantic cod. And we heard about how in the area of the Grand Banks, the cod stocks were so huge that we could fish and fish and fish without difficulty. You probably haven't eaten cod in your lifetime because cod now are extremely rare. We overfished and the populations crashed and they have not come back. So what was a common food source at one time is now essentially extinct. When we look at land mammals over the period of 1900 to 2000, what we see, as I mentioned earlier, is that in virtually all areas, the abundances are shrinking. The abundances of mammals are decreasing, both in terms of their geography and in their actual numbers. The last factor to consider is climate change. Climate change is indirectly affecting the abundances of species, contributing to their demise, reduction in numbers, and extinction. So how does that work? Well, climate change has multiple impacts. Some are direct, some are indirect. Let's just consider the consequences of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide changes the pH of the ocean. Changing the pH of the ocean affects the growth rate of corals. Warming oceans also result in bleaching. Why bleaching? Because the zooanthellae, part of that symbiotic relationships, are unable to tolerate sudden shifts in temperature, and they die. And when the zooanthellae die, the coral dies because they depend on the zooanthellae, part of their carbon resources. Changes in CO2 affect acidification. Warm deserts result in bleaching. We've also seen other kinds of changes that are affecting coral ecosystems. Storm systems are more frequent and they're stronger than they were in the past, and that affects structure. I recall here in the year 2020, we're having an exceptional number of hurricanes. Hurricanes and disruptive storms like that and typhoons are more common today than they were in the past. We haven't helped with the over-fertilization of our crops, which results in a pollution runoff into the ocean, resulting in algal blooms, and this has a negative effect on coral populations. And then as we change the currents, because of global warming, what we're seeing are changes in the degree to which the larvae are able to settle and where they settle. So maybe not a direct effect of climate change on corals, but a whole series of direct and indirect effects that are resulting in changes in the coral reef abundance. And of course, you know that the coral reef sustains not just the coral, but an ecosystem of other plants and animals. The changes in climate are actually quite complicated. Sometimes we think we understand it, but sometimes we don't. What we're discovering is for the local example, the marmot, that climate change is having some complex effects. If we look at long-term data, we see that changes in the winter are having a negative effect on the marmot. So changes in winter, shorter winters are having a negative effect. Warmer winters have a negative effect on marmot survival. But longer summers are having a positive effect. So what we see is multiple effects that climate change is having on animal populations. It's not always so simple and straightforward. And whether it's the negative effect on winter or the positive impact on summer survival that ends up affecting these populations is unclear at this time. But we do know that the components of life history are being impacted by climate changes. We have a concept called tipping points. That is when the climate changes in a certain point, it's not possible to go back. So reductions in sea ice are going to forever change the Arctic. That will have cascading effects on seals, polar bears, and so forth. The warming temperatures will have a negative effect on the permafrost, resulting in longer growing seasons, less harsh winters, and expansion of willows at the expense of the existing tundra grasses. What we have noticed already is that fires are becoming more common. Here you see an example of fires in the boreal forest. We've seen more fires here in the western United States. And the droughts are causing increased fire associated with dry conditions in the tropics. So what we have here is a whole series of effects, some of which are going to have a tipping point effect. So that is, once this effect takes place, it's not likely that we'll revert back to the original set of conditions.